Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a retrospective look at this past week. Last week we were talking about the potential for a couple fronts to come through that might generate some precipitation, particularly the midweek system. We only seen some very light scattered precipitation across extreme eastern Nebraska. For most locations, pretty much a high and dry setup. And of course, the front that came through yesterday was basically a dry front. So we did see the colder air move in, and we did see some hard freezing conditions across portions of the northern plains and the upper Midwest. Here in Nebraska, more or less scattered frost conditions. Now, we've seen some cooler conditions move in, and we expect that those will start to moderate as the weekend progresses, and then we'll pay attention to an upper air low that will be crossing the Rockies that potentially may generate some precipitation as we move into the early into middle part of next week. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what it is forecasting in regards to our precipitation and temperatures. And as we go to the upper air models for today, we are going to see that there is a pretty persistent trough across the upper Great Lakes. This is where most of the precipitation activity is going to remain. Very cool, damp conditions across the Great Lakes. For here in Nebraska, with the northwest flow, we're going to stay fairly cool across eastern Nebraska, northeast Nebraska, and probably north central Nebraska. It's going to be very difficult for them to struggle out of the upper 50s, maybe making it into the low 60s. As you get into western Nebraska, even though we're forecasting highs somewhere into the low to mid 80s, we have to recognize that this trough may actually push a little bit farther westward in terms of cold air, and so we may actually have to drop some temperatures 5 degrees, depending on how quickly this trough starts to break down as it moves eastward during the latter half of the day. But by the time we get to Sunday, this trough will start to move into the northeastern United States, and here comes the upper air low that is going to slowly drift toward the plains. So for tomorrow, we are expecting pretty much sunny skies, a little bit warmer conditions in the northeast Nebraska. We'll be pushing into the upper 60s. And in western Nebraska, where we're closer to the eastern edge of the ridge, we'll be looking at highs in the low 80s to possibly mid 80s. Now, as we get into Monday, this storm system starts to make its way into western Colorado, and there might be a little bit of moisture available for some very isolated showers to develop across the western third of the state, particularly late in the day. But we'll be looking for a little bit more warmth, rebounding into northeastern Nebraska with highs in the mid 70s. As you get into western Nebraska, we'll probably be pushing the mid to upper 80s, and I wouldn't be shocked if we see an isolated 90-degree mark come out of the panhandle. Now on Tuesday, the system starts to open up, so there is some moisture available. The best precipitation at this point in time would be for western Nebraska. We'd be looking at highs in the mid 70s across northern Nebraska to possibly the mid 80s across southeastern Nebraska. On Wednesday, this is where the real action by the models is indicating that we see some precipitation. Doesn't look like a significant amount, but it is precipitation. We're looking at highs in the low 70s across northeast Nebraska to the upper 70s across western Nebraska. On Thursday, the system starts to pass to our east. We'll be looking at highs in the lows to mid 70s in the northeast to the low 80s across the west. And on Friday, much warmer conditions. We'll be looking at mid to upper 70s across the northeast to the mid 80s across western Nebraska. 8 to 14-day forecasting indicates the cool conditions move to our east. And unfortunately, precipitation once again looks drier than normal.